Storm warning, so I know Morgan got some messages from some folks saying that they were going to hold back a little bit. Thankfully, it looks fine at the moment, but it was kind of gnarly earlier. But if you braved the storm and came out, thank you guys for coming. So we're talking interpretation, and last week we finished up talking about inspiration of the Bible, and we talked about Jesus's view of the Bible. What do you guys remember about how Jesus viewed the Bible? Any detail?
Inerrant?
Inerrant, yes. He believed that it is inerrant. What does inerrant mean? Infallible, without error. Absolutely. So he looked at it as if it was inerrant. All right? Rightfully so. What else do we remember about how Jesus viewed the Old Testament?
He followed it.
He followed it, definitely did that.
A lot of prophecies.
A lot of prophecies. And Jesus referenced a couple of the prophecies sometimes. A lot of the prophecies about Jesus we will know because Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John will make a comment about it saying, he's fulfilling this prophecy here by that. Very good. How did Jesus view certain events in history that some people might dismiss as being a fable or not true? Things like Noah and the ark, Jonah and the whale. How did Jesus talk about those things?
As if they were factual.
Yeah, he brought them up as if they were factual. And if somebody wants to make the argument, well, he was referencing them as just a story, they kind of lose their weight and their meaning. Because if he's just comparing something to a story and he's saying that I'm going to be raised up in 3 days just like Jonah did, well, if Jonah really wasn't really raised up in 3 days, then that's not a really convincing argument to make that he would raise up in 3 days. Very good. So after we talked about Jesus and his view of the Bible, we started to look at some of the rules of interpretation. And I believe we went through the first two. There we go. So we went through number one, have an attitude open to the message. Why is that an important detail? Why do we need to have an open heart towards the message? Yeah.
Because if you don't have an open heart and attitude towards it, you're probably not going to believe it.
Absolutely. The chances of you coming to belief whenever you're saying, I don't believe this, is much, much, much lower. I heard somebody else say something.
Just no preconceived ideas.
Yeah, and that, so I've not brought this up yet, but I'm glad that you say that. No preconceived ideas. That'll tie in with our number 11 here. Read out of a verse the meaning, not into it. So don't have preconceived ideas as you come to it. An argument can be made, and I think that is fair, that it is impossible to come to the Bible and not have some preconceived ideas. However, do you allow those preconceived ideas to push you where you want to go? Or do you say, look, I know I have some experiences, I have maybe some biases on what I think about the Bible. I'm going to set those aside. And I believe you absolutely can set those aside and come to the Bible with those preconceived ideas separated from you. You got to acknowledge them, but you don't want to use them whenever you're reading this. Good. All right, the Bible must harmonize with itself. We talked about that at the end. What's the importance of the Bible must harmonize with itself?
Does it create any questions?
Yeah, the Bible, I think I stopped halfway through this one. Let me even take a step back here. What is harmony?
Not contradicting.
Not contradicting. All right, so we know that it is not contradicting, but I love the word harmony because it actually adds something more to it. It's not even a not contradiction, it's something a little bit even more.
It just goes together well.
It goes together well, all right? It's not the exact same thing, all right? So if Adam was not teaching his class, I'd pick his brain because he's the music guy. But harmony is two things that are telling the same story, but they are together. And the Bible really does work that way. There are multiple stories, multiple messages that will be told in the Bible, and all of them fit together. Abby, I'm so sorry, music person here. Literally right behind the seat that Adam was sitting in, I could not get any worse. I've known you longer too, so you can shame me later, okay? It's good. But the Bible's got to harmonize with itself. Why does the Bible have to harmonize with itself?
Because it's in it.
It strengthens the message.
Yes, so two things here. We got number one, because it is inerrant. And what you are saying there is perfectly describing it. It adds to it. It validates it. It gives it depth. And the Bible has incredible depth to it. Whenever you're able to see it from a slightly different direction, but they're not against each other, it helps you understand what the Bible is saying a little bit better. That's especially the case with the records of Jesus and the stories about Jesus and the views of Matthew and John. I think the one thing that I did not bring up about that topic was this here. If you view the Bible and you approach the Bible as being a book full of contradictions, you're going to have a big problem here. Number one, you're going to ignore the verses that very clearly say, this is from God, and this is trustworthy. You have to ignore those verses to be able to say the Bible has contradictions all in it. It will deny, please let's turn to this verse here. It denies the ability of God to communicate. This verse is one of my favorite verses that I use whenever we're talking about God doing things. In apologetics, on defending who God is, defending the Christian belief system. Normally, whenever you're trying to explain to somebody that is not a believer, you start talking about God in the first place. You say, there is a God, but I'm not going to use the Bible right away to try to defend the existence of God. The reason why is because people will look at the Bible and say, well, that's just a book. It's written by somebody. But God can be believed in just from nature around us. Now, we're going to have a very limited view of who he is, but there's a reason why all these Greek philosophers and people back in before Jesus' time came to believe that there is a God. It's from nature that they figured this thing out. Once you acknowledge that there is a God, the next logical question is, well, could that God have told us about himself? Could he have revealed himself not just in nature, but in a message to someone? Is there a Bible? And that's really where this comes in. And that's why I love this verse. Acts chapter 26, verse 8. Who wants to read that one? Yeah.
Why should it be thought incredible by you that God raises the dead?
This is Paul whenever he's on trial, and he's talking with people about, hey, I'm a Christian. And he brings up and boils down the argument into this one sentence. He's saying, like, I am a Christian because I believe that God raised Jesus from the dead. And he asks the question, why is it thought incredible by anyone that God would raise the dead? As soon as you acknowledge there is a God, of course he can raise somebody from the dead. If you're going to acknowledge that there's a God, of course he could give us words and a message that can be understood and can be free from error. If we're going to say God can't do that, we've got some problems. Okay? And I also have a number 3. You miss out on some very obvious answers. If you believe that the Bible is full of contradictions, you can miss out on some really obvious answers to some questions. If you search online, there's tons of websites that'll do a top 100 contradictions in the Bible, and it'll be a list of things that people that are not Christians will say, this is why the Bible you can't be trusted. And they'll list all these off. And if you look through some of those questions, some of them are comical. Some of them are legitimately hard things like, okay, this is a tough situation. I got to figure this out. I don't know how these fit together. But some of them are just like, well, if you literally looked at the next verse, it gave you the answer. But whenever you're coming to the Bible and saying that it's got contradictions, you are going to assume that two things can't fit together. But whenever you look at the Bible as being from God, you can see, wait, those things aren't actually opposing each other. Those things actually can fit, and you have a deeper understanding. Long story short, come to the Bible and you're going to have to interpret it all as one. So if you got one verse over here, don't interpret it in a way that would invalidate and go against everything else. So if you come across a particular passage and you say, oh, this tells us then that God is a mean, terrible God. Well, sorry, that really doesn't fit with all of Scripture. Maybe your understanding of that one verse is off, and you should readjust. Yes?
So on this, while the Bible doesn't have secret codes per se, there
Yes.
are oftentimes where the Hebrew writers are doing some fairly elaborate things that are not obvious to us because we are not native Hebrew speakers.
Yes.
They are doing interesting wordplay. They do some things with numbers. But when those things happen, they are in harmony with the rest of Scripture itself.
Yes.
Like when you find, like I believe one of the ones is like the genealogy of Noah.
Mm-hmm.
The meaning of those names creates a sentence, which is like, whoa. But the sentence is more or less God saves.
Yeah, it's not nothing. Yeah, you're not going to get anything that's going to contradict anything else.
It is in harmony with the rest of Scripture.
Yeah. I know that Psalm 119, longest chapter in the whole Bible, the whole thing is an acrostic. I mean, in the Hebrew alphabet, each one starts off with A, B, C, D, in each one. Just little fun ways that the Jews wrote their poems. And it's just, you don't have to know it, but it does add flavor once you do know it. Yes?
And don't you think if somebody's looking for contradictions in the Bible, when they find it, they're going to stop right there. They're not going to go any further or look back. Oh, there's what I need. And that's
Absolutely. Many times it ends up being I'm looking for justification for what I already believe. And that's something even we can be, we can do that same thing with a particular belief. Like, for example, people that have a Calvinist background. Calvinism is the belief that there is no real free will with people. God chooses those whom he's going to save, and he's going to condemn everybody else that he doesn't. That's not my view. But whenever I'm looking at these verses in the Bible, there's some verses that look a lot like that, and I can understand why they come to that conclusion. You got to look at everything. You can't just stop and just read the verses you want. You have to look at all of them together, even the ones that make it uncomfortable. So, yes.
It's interesting you used Psalms 119,
Mhm.
because he says over and over again, he says, with all my heart.
Mhm.
With my whole heart, or all my heart.
Psalm 119 is fantastic. Is fantastic. Okay, so let's look at number 3. Number 3 here, and there's no particular order with any of these. Look at the background of the writing. Do some history research on this. It's not as hard as what you think it is. We mentioned a long time ago the technical fancy word for the way that people would describe how we are supposed to understand the Bible is historical grammatical. All right? Historical grammatical. How were the individual words used in their original writing? That's what we want to do. We want to find out how were these words used back then. Well, how do you learn about things back then?
You read your history.
History. That's it. You need to know a little bit of history. So are you telling me that the only way I can be saved is if I study history? No, not quite. But if you want to get a good understanding of how these words were meant, you need to understand a little bit about what things were like when the Bible was written. Okay? So, for example, there's a couple different ways that we can do this. Look at the title of the book. All right, the title is going to tell you some information about a passage. Let's say you you're studying through Deuteronomy, and there's a passage in there that you're saying, what in the world is this particular verse talking about? I don't know. Well, look at the book that you're reading in, and you're reading Deuteronomy. All right, well, what is Deuteronomy? Well, anybody know anything about Deuteronomy?
It's a retelling of the law.
It's a retelling of the law. All right, and actually, I'll mention a language later on. If you want to get real deep, you can go in and learn that the word Deuteronomy is actually from a Greek phrase meaning second law. It's the second telling of the law. And that's already going to tell you right now, maybe this is a law that was written to Jewish people back a long time ago. Just getting the title can give you something. If you're reading from a book called Philippians, who do you think that book was written to? The Philippians. Yes, good job. Congratulations. That's really what this is you're just looking at the title, and that's going to narrow down a little bit more of what you know. Look at the author. Are all the authors in the Bible the same?
Unless you count God being the only.
Yeah, you got the trick question there, yes. So yes and no. So yes, it all comes from God. However, it was done through people. Individuals were moved by the Spirit. How would you guys describe Paul's writings if you've read the Bible enough? How would you describe Paul's writings from, say, John's writings? This is a deeper question, so I don't expect everybody. If you don't know this, don't worry. That's okay.
Many of Paul's writings were specific letters to specific churches.
Yes.
As opposed to John, who kind of wrote a lot of history and the fact that Jesus is the Christ, come from God.
Absolutely. So Paul's writings were generally towards specific churches, and they're also very complicated. If you look at the original Greek, he does run-on sentence, which is okay. All right, that was okay in that language. It's bad in ours, but it would just go on and on and on and on and on, and you're saying, Paul, take a breath, okay? But that's just how he would write, and he would use very big words. John, on the other hand, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He's very simple, but very deep. Two very different men writing in very unique ways. And knowing their personalities a little bit can help you understand a passage a little bit better. All right? The date, when was this written? Who was it written to? All of these different things. So all of these details are going to help you know what the author is talking about. It'll help you focus your attention on the topic. And this is why this is not a hard thing here. These details can usually be found in a good study Bible. All right. How many of you all have a study Bible by chance? Okay, yeah, most people here. If you would, the website I suggest is BibleHub.com. I've used different websites before. I like Bible Hub a lot because it's got more than I think other places do. But you can read on those websites, or you can read in a good study Bible, usually a good summary of a book before you get to it. So before Philippians, it'll tell you this book was written by Paul to the church at Philippi, probably at this date. If you look in Acts, he probably wrote it during this time when he was on his missionary journeys. There you go. And that helps you focus a little bit more on what's going on. So I recommend a good study Bible. I can personally recommend Apologetics Press has a study Bible that they use a lot of the stuff from their website, and they've got a New King James version that you can get off their website. It can run you a little bit, but it's honestly really worth the extra money. They'll have little footnotes that if it's a tough passage, they'll say, here's an explanation for it. It's very helpful. So as an example here, 2 Timothy's messaging is more significant knowing it was written towards the end of Paul's life. In 2 Timothy 4, verse 7. Anybody know what that one is, or you can flip to it? It's a famous passage.
Fought the good fight.
I fought the good fight. I finished the race. All right, well is he just talking about a racing metaphor here? I fought the good fight. So you're talking boxing. Literally, he's talking about boxing here. I finished the race, finished the course. He's talking about racing now. No. He's talking about fighting and he's talking about racing. But we also know he was writing this towards the end of his life. Was he talking about a literal fight or a literal race? What was he talking about?
He lived a good life.
He's talking about his life. He's talking about his spiritual life. And that gives it a newer depth of meaning and appreciation. Any questions or comments on this, looking at the background? Yep.
Josh, I think with Paul, he's struggling because he's thinking about the people, the Christians that he, put to death, and the whole thing through his whole life as a Christian, or as a religious man, actually. So I see the struggle, that whole fight, thinking about, oh man, I killed all these people,
But he doesn't say the word struggle. Why? But you are saying struggle.
I'm saying struggle.
And guess what? You're right. That's a fair word to take from that because of the word usage that he used and our knowledge of his life and the situations that he went through. I think that is a very valid observation that you're making there. Other comments and thoughts on this?
Paul also said that somewhere else, that he buffeted his own body to keep his own self in subjection.
Yes.
Also, so that's still where
It's a very physical.
fighting. It was a physical and spiritual fighting for him.
By the way, you're quoting the KJV there. I buffet my body. So I in preaching school, I learned I buffet my body daily. One of my few Bible jokes there. It's one of my favorites, and you'll hear me say it a lot. Just laugh next time you hear me say it. But yes, it's another physical description that he uses. And knowing his life, you can understand where he's coming from with those words. Very good. All right, we're clicking along here. Let's look at number 3 still, sorry. I guess I'm covering some other issues here I forgot about. Look at who it's being written to. So you're talking about where who is the author, but also where is it going to, the audience, their histories here. I think this will mean very little to us as Gentiles 2,000 years later. The way that he references some prophecies about Jesus are really tough. This week I've been studying about Matthew chapter 2, and whenever he's talking about Jesus being called a Nazarene. And that's a tough passage because there's no Old Testament passage. There's no one passage that says Jesus will be called a Nazarene. So what is he referencing? And it's really tough. Some people think that he's making wordplay based on Hebrew. And the explanations that are given are things that would make sense to a Jewish audience, but would not immediately make sense to us today. The only thing you need to know about it is they have an audience in mind. And since we're not the primary audience, don't feel bad if you don't pick up on it. The truth is Jesus was a Nazarene, and the Bible does allude to that in different ways. That's all you really need to know. But whenever you look at Mark was really punchy and short. Some people think it was written to the Romans, or at least to a more city crowd, because it was very fast. The word immediately shows up in Mark over and over again. He's like, immediately this, immediately that, immediately this. Luke was a doctor, all right? And so he uses words in there that are really technical sometimes. John is a very personal letter that is clearly written to many people. Knowing these backgrounds can help give you some depth of understanding. And the feeling of the Jews towards the Romans will shed light on their actions with Jesus. On my sermon that I gave about John 6, whenever the Jews wanted to take Jesus by force to make him a king because he made food, probably it's because they saw, hey, we've got a quartermaster here that can make us food while we're out fighting. That's probably where their mind was going. And we know this because we know the history. We've studied this and know a little bit more. Now I'm done with that point, sorry. All right, so this next one is about genre. All right, what is genre? I know, I see Sarah laughing over here because I know she's a bookie. Are you willing to, you don't have to answer. What's the genre?
It's like the type of book, so like fantasy, biography, sci-fi, different.
So there's fantasy books in the Bible and sci-fi books and romance books?
Books in general.
No, yes. By the way, it's exactly right. Yeah. There's different kinds of books. There's different kinds of movies. Well, even in the Bible, there's different kinds of books and different types of writing that make up the Bible. Well, the problem is that if you go in and you think, I'm gonna watch a romance movie, and it turns out to be a horror movie, you're gonna be really unsettled real fast. You're like, this is not the direction I was thinking that it was going to go. You're going into it a little bit differently. In the Bible, the same thing can happen. We need to know a little bit about what kind of writing it is, because the same words and the same ideas might be brought up in different genre, and it be understood just a little bit differently. There's some rules that you need to learn about this, okay? That most people don't even think about it, okay? Talking about like horror movies and things like that. People that are horror nerds know that there's always like the first girl. Like there's always a girl that is going to survive by the end of the movie. That's just how they make movies. I don't know why all the horror movies do that, but that's just something that you pick up on whenever you've watched them enough. Well, likewise, in the Bible, whenever you learn about poetry, you're like, well, this is how Jewish poems work. There's some ways that they do things, and if you can pick up on those, you can appreciate it a little bit more. So, we've got here, the Bible was written over a very long period of time, thousands of years. It was written by a lot of people. There's 66 books. And it's going to be in a lot of different styles. That's what the genre is just think style or type of writing here. And they're going to use words differently in different ways. The example I have here is that if you're reading a book on parenting, it's going to be very different from a book that is a detective story. Sherlock Holmes and The Strong-Willed Child by Dobson are two very different books. the way you approach them is going to be very different. If you're reading Sherlock Holmes and saying, how can I be a better detective? Ooh, that might not be the one to do it. But if you're reading Strong-Willed Child, that's supposed to be more practical. Also, U.S. Constitution. There's a certain way you want to read the U.S. Constitution. It is not the same thing as Twilight. If you don't know Twilight, that was the vampire romance movie that was super popular with teenagers a couple years ago. A lot more than that, actually. I know, I'm getting old. You don't read those things the same way. They're very, very different. They might use the same language, the same words, but they mean it different ways here. So, genres included in the Bible. I've got a list here, but I want to see what all you guys know. What do you think are different ways, different genres of the Bible? History is one of them. What else? Poetry is one. Law is one. Apocalyptic is one. Prophecy is one.
Genealogy?
I didn't put it on the list, but I wanted to, and I didn't have space. Frankly, I would say not just genealogies, but lists in general. It's a thing. It had purpose. So lists. Yeah, epistles or specific teaching is how I phrased it, but I've seen it phrased different ways. So yeah, history, poetry, and proverbs, wisdom literature is a way to call it. Prophecy, law, didactic, teaching, just teaching something, instruction. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount is a good example of that. Parables. They deserve their own little attention because they follow their own little rules and ways that they are taught. Apocalyptic, you're talking your Revelation and Ezekiel and some other things. Now, most people understand naturally these differences. When you're going through them, you don't need to have somebody go through and say, oh, by the way, that's law. Like you kind of understand, oh, that's law. I need to understand law a certain way. As with all things in interpretation, most of the time we do this without even realizing it. All we're doing is just we're paying attention to it so we make sure that we do things right. All right, so let's go through these, and this is the longest of the rules that we're going to cover. The rest of them are much shorter here. But I do want us to look at some of the genres and know a few fun details about them. So first of all, history. If I'm reading history, where can I find history in the Bible? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Chronicles, Judges, Ruth, Ezra, Nehemiah. Yeah, it's a lot of the Old Testament is history, but and I've seen some people that have listed Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as Gospels because they are a unique type. It's history too. All right, it's telling the history of Jesus. So the Gospels are history, but they're also something else in a way. So this includes most of Genesis through Esther and Matthew through Acts. All right. Well, how do you understand a historical account? How should you approach a history book? How should we approach history in the Bible? Well, what do you guys think are some common sense ways that if you're going to understand history, how should words be used? Should it be complicated? No. What's that? Literal. Who said literal? Yeah, thank you. Yes. By and large, it's got to be literal. Why would it be a problem if history was written figuratively?
Facts.
Yeah, it's supposed to be recording facts. I want you to think about the history of the Roman Empire, and we want to find out about how Rome fell. And then we flip through it, and it talks about, I don't know how it fell. This is a bad analogy here. But anyways, let's say it goes through and it talks about, then the unicorns came in and attacked, and you're like, wait, there were unicorns back then? Oh, no, this is a history book. You can't take things as literal. They're figures. Like, no, if you're telling history, you by and large want things to be very literal and real. Right? That's just how you tell a story. But more than that, does it detail every single thing that happened throughout history? No, all right. We do not have a record of what Jesus ate on a Thursday evening of like 480. I don't know. We don't have a record of that. Why don't we have a record of that? Doesn't matter. Not important. Absolutely. The things that are recorded are generally recorded for moral teaching. There's some sort of a lesson that you're supposed to get from this. That's why it's recorded. It's something significant to us. So I've got, I got Moses up here. All right, so as an example, Exodus chapter 14, it talks about the crossing of the Red Sea. Now, there are people, I've met them before, that will say that that did not literally happen. Or the crossing of the Red Sea was actually crossing the Reed Sea, and the Reed Sea is a marsh. When I was at the hospital doing chaplaincy, I really loved a guy that I met there, Carl. And Carl's a Baptist pastor. But Carl talked about that, and he believes in a literal understanding of these things too. But Carl said, well, here's the issue. People that are saying that they didn't cross the Red Sea, they crossed the Reed Sea. He said, well, you got one of two miracles here. They either crossed the Red Sea and God destroyed the Egyptians afterwards, or the Egyptians all died in that much water. Pick your miracle. And I remember him saying that, and I'm like, thank you, Carl.
It was still dry land, so the marsh would have had to have been dry.
Yeah. It's a pick your miracle here. I really do. Cross the Red Sea, okay? Right, they crossed. Something happened here. It's regarded as literal. Why, though, was that recorded? Why not what they were wearing for shoes or something? I don't know.
Shows God's power.
Yep. There's a moral lesson here, all right? There's lots of moral lessons that you can take from this, but it's a great demonstration that we can trust God because He provides for His people, even in extreme situations. There is significance for these things being recorded. It's the same thing you can find in history books or something like that. The reason why these things are carried on is because they are important and we feel like it's important for other people to know. These are things that the Holy Spirit felt important for us to know. Even genealogies, even these crazy lists that seem like that everybody snoozes on whenever they come to in the Bible. Most people, I'm going to try to read through the Bible in a year, and they get through Leviticus, and they start, and it's like, it's done. It's like once they get to the list of all these different laws or the genealogies, they just stop because it doesn't seem practical. There was a reason why the Holy Spirit put that in there, if anything, to let you know that God cares about each and every one of those people, that there was a plan through all of that. So, by the way, I personally don't mind people I have to skip through that. Yeah, as long as you recognize why it's there, that's the really important part on that. But still try to go through them because the names are fun. Yes?
I was a history major in college.
Yes.
And the very first class that we had to take was all about perspectives.
Yes.
Recognizing that there can be actual facts, but depending on who's telling the story, it will look very different.
Yes.
So the way that we interpret the American Revolution is very different than how the British do.
Great example.
Many examples of that, where, in the Bible, multiple people would have witnessed the same thing, but written about it very differently based on what they observed.
Now, that does not mean that they didn't happen. It means you're acknowledging that these are humans that are involved in this somewhere. And there is and also, I think that it's fair to say the Bible is biased. All right, these are people that are convinced that they have seen Jesus rise from the dead, and they have seen the working of the Holy Spirit through the church. And these people, they are very biased, and they are A-okay letting you know that because they cannot help but share the things that they have seen and heard. So, I like that fact. Very excellent point. Thank you. Yes.
Well, I was just going to say the very way that we read the Bible typically is as a nonfiction book.
Yes.
Because if you're reading nonfiction versus fiction, in nonfiction you can go to a specific place in that book Your example, Exodus 14, if I want to know about crossing the Red Sea.
Mhm.
I don't have to start at Genesis and read all the way to Exodus to figure that out. But with a fiction book, you can't say, I'm going to go to chapter 13 and see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
You have to start at chapter 1 and read it in sequence to the end,
Mhm.
or you miss lots of things
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
are important.
Yeah.
And not so with the Bible. You can go to a specific passage to learn about a specific topic.
And I am thankful for the people that have organized the Bible into book, chapter, and verse so that we can reference things a lot easier. I think I said this before, but evidently the Bible, I'm 99% sure I said this, the Bible as being in a leaf format like this was because of Christians. The reason why we have books today that are in leaves like that are because of Christians. Because they wanted to have, it was all scrolls and stuff before that, but the early Christians wanted to have a way that they could quickly reference different things and compare them, and they popularized this format of book. So thanks to Christians, even if you're not a Christian, thanks some early Christians for having books as they are. Yes?
I would, however, encourage you to read it like a story, though, and try to, because we can lose some stuff when we start to narrow down too much into a single section of scripture, and often it is presented more like a story narrative and less as a textbook history, even though it is history.
It is not a
It's presented in
textbook.
story fashion.
It is not a history textbook, nor is it a science textbook. That doesn't mean that there's not science or history in it. There's absolutely things to take from it. I'm on the same page with you, yes.
You understand the context of it better when you read it like a story.
Yes.
You know, you can easily misinterpret something by taking it out of context if you're not reading through that.
The key, and I know the bell rang, the key is that even though we're reading it as a story, to remember that just because it's a story doesn't mean that it's not true or not reliable. I'm always kind of wary whenever I'm talking about what topic do we need to cover for a Bible class. Well, we haven't done one on New Testament characters in a while. And inevitably, like somebody like characters, like in a story, like, yes, but that doesn't mean that they're not real. So it is a story, but it is also a story of history. And law and poetry and prophecy and some other things that we're going to talk about next week. So thank you all very, very much for your time. I'll be around if you have any questions.